Thank you so much, Jean, for your kind introduction. So I am extremely honored to introduce Ms. Masako Wada. I'm so happy to share the same first name as well. She's Assistant Secretary General of Nihon Hidankyo, the Japan Confederation of Atomic and H-bomb Sufferers Organization. And she's a Hibakusha atomic bombing survivor in Nagasaki. And many of you might have seen her because she has been in many international nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament conferences, including the negotiation of a nuclear weapons ban treaty. She's the one who gave the signature from all over the world to Ambassador Elayne Whyte. So she's also looking forward to seeing Ambassador Whyte today. But without further ado, I would like to give a microphone to Ms. Wada. So Ms. Wada, so microphone is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Masako-san. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I am Masako Wada. Thank you for this opportunity to see all of you. Today, I'll be speaking about my mother's experience on that day of bombing and what has happened since then. I was born in 1943. The atomic bomb was dropped when I was 1 and 10 months old. I was at home 2.9 kilometers away from the epicenter in the northern part of Nagasaki city. I don't remember anything about what happened on that day. I was able to survive thanks to the landscape of Nagasaki, which is surrounded by mountains. I grew up listening to my mother talking about her experience from time to time. A fire broke out from the epicenter to the southern part of the city. To escape the fire, wounded and burned people crossed the mountain to come down into the city. My mother saw the movement of people lined up like ants. Their hair was so matted with blood that she couldn't even tell if they were male or female. They were almost naked. She trembled seeing the black and writhing line of people coming down the mountain. Many people are believed to have died on that mountain road. Right next to my house was a vacant lot due to building evacuation. The bodies that had been abandoned on the street were carried into the lot in garbage carts and piled up on the ground. The corpses were cremated day and night. She became desensitized to the smell and the sheer number of people in front of her eyes. She said that everybody became numb to what was happening. What was human dignity? Should human beings be treated like that? We are not created to be burned like garbage. There was a well at the back of our house. A number of people who had been severely injured came there for water. Carrying me on her back, my mother cleaned their wounds, and she used old clothes which she had boiled there beforehand as bandages. She never knew what happened to those people. She was sent to help the doctors at the university auditorium, where a first aid station had been set up. My mother fainted at the sight of the floor completely covered with people with extremely severe injuries and burns. When she regained consciousness, the first task she was assigned to was to brush off numerous maggots the size of her thumb from the patients. She was 24 years years old at that time. The US forces dropped radio sensors attached to parachutes when they dropped the atomic bomb. This was to measure the power, blast, and heat of the bomb and report to the headquarters. What actually happened under the atomic cloud? Civilians, including the elderly, women, and children died. 210,000 people died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as of December 1945. Each of them had a family and a life. The preciousness of life, human dignity, and humanitarian consequences. Didn't the radio sensor report that? These. My mother would remember the stench and talk about this every year on August 9th, the anniversary of the bombing. In 1946, the first UN General Assembly was held, and the first resolution was about nuclear disarmament. What has the world been doing to achieve this goal? They decided that it was the first priority for the UN to address. And a new committee was formed to solve the issues regarding nuclear weapons. It's been 76 years since the atomic bombing by the US force. The average age of Hibakusha, or survivors of the bomb, is now 84. Every year, around 9,000 people pass away. We Hibakusha have been sincerely and faithfully working toward the abolition of nuclear weapons without taking even a single day of rest. Both the Japanese government and the US government turned a blind eye on those of us who were exposed to radiation for 10 years. We have received no support, neither medical nor economical. With intensive news censorship by the US, the casualties were completely covered up. We Hibakusha were abandoned when we needed help the most. During a press conference in September 1945, Deputy Commander General Thomas Farrell, the person in charge of Manhattan Project, said, "People who were supposed to die have already died. There is nobody who is suffering from the radiation." After such a statement, Hibakusha, the citizen of the defeated nation, had no choice but to remain silent. The bikini accident occurred in 1954. And in 1956, 11 years after the bombing of Japan, Hibakusha, who had been hiding and suffering, finally banded together and started to act to make their voices heard. They formed our Japan Confederation of A and H bomb sufferers organization. Our resolution was to not only save ourselves, but also through our experiences, save humankind from the crisis. We stood up and have been working together ever since. In Japan and even from overseas, people who hope for a world without nuclear weapons have been supporting us. we continue to talk about our own experiences, although we suffer each and every time we relive our moments of agony and grief. This sense of mission and determination have been sustaining us, the Hibakusha. On July 7th, 2017, when the UN adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, many Hibakusha shared our joy with each other, grateful to have survived to witness this moment. Our joy was for those who have spent their entire lives for this initiative and for the 210,000 people who died on the day of bombing. The heavy iron doors that we had been pounding on had finally opened a little, and we saw a ray of light coming through. And on January 22nd of this year, our long-held hope and demand that TPNW went into effect as an international law. While this is a source of jubilation, we acknowledge this as the first step of a new beginning. What is now required of the world? The threat of the use of nuclear weapons is imminent. The International Conference of the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons concluded that no country or organization has treatment options for the victims. Hibakusha have seen or experienced death, disease, poverty, and discrimination. These are also what we are seeing right now in the world as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. In a few years, there will be various vaccines, and things will be under control to some extent. However, if nuclear weapons are used, there will be nothing left but the earth devoid of human beings. There will be nobody who can be proud of their power, honor, or status. There will be nobody left to toll the bell for the dead. We Hibakusha are not merely survivors of the atomic bombing. We are the ones who have been taking action to save mankind from this crisis. We are the ones entrusted with this mission. We humans can probably live with the coronavirus, but not with nuclear weapons. We humans created them and will be the ones to abolish them. This is for the public benefit. To do this, Hibakusha will take whatever time remains to each of us to continue to walk with all of you. I was there 76 years ago, and I'm here to tell you our ardent and sincere desire of all the Hibakusha. Please learn, think, speak, and act to abolish nuclear weapons as citizens of the earth and as diplomats with your precious and noble mission. Thank you very much for your listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wada. Jean?
Yes, Masako.
Yeah. Do we have a time for the?
Absolutely. We have about 10 minutes or so. May I, before we do so, because I forgot to do that, also welcome the undergraduate fellows that we invited to attend this session. I see they're online, so I also wanted to draw other participants' attention that we have a group of 13 undergrad students that are fellows here at the Middlebury Institute, and we've invited them to today's session. So, Masako, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Ms. Wada. We have a little bit of a time for the question and answer. She kindly agreed to answer some of your questions. So maybe better to get a question from the chat function. So, but first and foremost, let's have a, word of appreciation to Ms. Wada. どうもありがとうございます。Over this.
Thank you.
Yeah, we should never forget this. Blanche said, thank you for reminding us of this. We must not allow humanity to forget that horror. So 人類は絶対ね、これ忘れてはいけないことだと思います。Okay, so are there any questions? I'm not officially a trained interpreter, but I will do my best. I happen to speak English and Japanese, so I will do my best.
Yeah.
I suggest if anyone has a question, just raise your virtual hand and then we will recognize you. I think Ms. Wada's presentation, as always, is so emotionally loaded that I think everyone needs to take a moment or two to reflect. So, Ms. Wada, maybe I'll start and just ask a quick question. You mentioned that none of the survivors have ever been offered any compensation. Is this still the case? I mean, we had a discussion earlier in this course about the aftermath and impact of nuclear testing in some of the islands and so on, and the responsibility of those countries that have tested to clean up and to compensate the victims. I am equally shocked that nothing has been done to address the suffrage of the ongoing suffrage of the Hibakusha.
和田さん、ちょっとだけ説明していいですか？
はいはい、どうぞ。
すみません。どな
保証ですね。
保証に関して、誰もそれを受けれなかったということですけれども、
はい
今の状況はどうですかっていう感じ、
はい
今はどんな感じですか？なぜかというと、以前、このコースでニュークリアテスト、核実験の被害者に
核実験ですね
のそういう話も出ましたので、ジョンさんはそれに関してちょっと興味があるそうです。はい。
はい。被団協ができてから、被爆者はずっと運動をして、そして自分たち自身を救うだけじゃなくてという働きをやってきましたね。だからそれで少し医療費が出るようにはなったんです。
Okay.
ということですね。
はい、わかりました。
はい。
So, at the very beginning, they were not able to get any compensation, but thanks to the Ms. Wada's organization, Hidankyo, Japanese A and H bomb sufferers organization, the atomic bombing survivors are now receiving some compensation, such as medical fees.
だから運動をしないと何も出てこないということですね。
Yeah, so the point is, thanks to the activism, that they were able to get such a compensation. So the point is, if atomic bombing survivors hadn't act, this couldn't have happened. So the important thing is this activism.
Thank you. We have a question from Tara.
Hi, my name's Tara. I'm an undergraduate fellow. I was wondering if you could talk about the role of young people in helping survivors of the atomic bombs or other nuclear tests.
若い人たちですね。
そうです。はい、若い人たちの、That's great question.
若い人たちが何を今、
はい、サバイバ
ー。
ーの、そうですね、あと被爆者の方とか、核実験の被害者などを助けるために、どういうことができるでしょうか、ということです。はい。
若い人たちも本当に今、盛んに活動しています。まず、議員に、あれですね、国会議員とかそういう人たちに呼びかけて、いろいろ喚起し、批准するようにとかね、条約に批准をするようにとか、そういうことを呼びかけることをしてます。選挙行動に影響が出るような行動をしてます。
つまり若い人たちがもっと政治的なこともやればいいということですよね。
やってます。
やってます。今の現状。今、はい。Currently, the young people are getting more and more active, especially they are involved in some political activities. So, for example, they are asking the parliamentarians and congressmen to ratify the TPNW, the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, and also they are trying to be more influential the outcome of the election because the politicians are the one who decide the policy.
Thank you. Ricardo, do you want to also briefly just introduce yourself to Ms. Wada?
Thank you. I would like to thank Ms. Wada for her testimony. I think it was very touching, and I think that everyone who had the chance to hear and to listen carefully is aware of the consequences of nuclear power. I am Ricardo Miranda. I am from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Bolivia. I'm taking part in this course as a representative from my ministry. So the question that I wanted to ask is if Mrs. Wada maybe could elaborate a little bit more on the efforts that underwent to clean or to clear the bombing sites from radiation, and how was to try to go back to a normal life in this situation, and if there were any steps taken by survivors themselves in order to rebuild the cities. Thank you.
ボリビアの外務省の方です。で、質問はですね、
放射能ですね。
原爆、放射能とかそのクリーンナップのことですね。どのようにされたかということと、その被爆者の方の被爆、アトミックボーミングの後にどのような努力をしてその町を復興させるようなことをされたでしょうかという、その復興に関わる質問ですね。特に被爆者の方がどういうことをされたかということですね。2つ質問がありますね。放射能をどういうふうにクリーンアップしたかということと、被爆者の方が復興にどのように関わったかということ。
放射能に関しては目に見えない、今ほど知識がないですよね。だから放射能を除去するというようなアイディアは何もないわけですよ。だから今考えるととっても怖いこと。だから何もできなかったというのが本当です。そこまで言ってくださいますか？
はい、わかりました。In terms of the radiation, when the bomb was dropped, there was no knowledge or, about radiation on the side of Japan. So, realistically, there is nothing the Japan could do at that time.
だから今福島の原発のことが起こってて、除染作業が一生懸命なされてますけど、そういうことは一切やってません。できなかった。だから、はい。
So just some comparison. I think you know about Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. So of course, when that happened, Japan has a enormous knowledge about how radiation works. So that the government and both the local and central government are working to clean up the radiation. But again, when that 76 years ago, there was no knowledge about radiation. So this is kind of a good comparison. 76 years ago, Japan really couldn't do anything.
それは みんな、レディエーションのインフルエンスがどのくらいあるかということは、アメリカが何も言わなかったんです。隠してたんですね。それが一番大きなことです。それをひた隠しに隠して、どんなに放射能の影響があるかっていうことは何にも言わなかった。だから死ぬべきものはみんな死んでしまったって言いましたよね。それと同じように、だからみんな知ることができなかったということです。
Okay, so the biggest problem at the time of the United States didn't share any information about the radiation. So it was kind of a secret for a while. So again, this also led to the no action on the Japan side.
放射能の影響がどのくらいあるかということをアメリカはとっても知りたかったんですね。でそれが非人道的なものであるということも知ってたんです。それを隠してたということが本当にもう大きな罪というかね、そういうことだというふうに思っております。
So the radiation, the United States, of course, knew the impact of radiation to human body, but they didn't tell Japan. And from the humanitarian perspective, this is like a atrocious, crime against humanity because they knew the impact of the radiation to human body. じゃあ次に、
だから、
すいません。
傷とかやけどがない人もそれは体内被爆と言いますね。体内被爆によって、そして後でどんどんなくなっていったということです。
So as you may know, the impact of the nuclear weapons, like a blast and like some, lots of injuries. But even if someone looked okay, but there was some internal injury because of the radiation, and they developed the symptom later. はい、そして、和田さん、そして被爆者の方のご努力っていうか、なんか、そういう死の復興のためにどういうことをされたか。
公には何もできなかったと思います。自分たちはもう本当にもうみんなが被爆者ですからね。体も弱い、健康的にも弱いものですよね。それから、食べ物も十分ではない。それから働けないからお金もない。もう本当にもういろんなことが重なって、いろいろなディスクリミネーションもありましたしね、そういうものもあって、辛い目にたくさんあって、その他のもの、自分たちのことだけしかもう考えられなかったというふうに思いますね。はい。
はい。In terms of the efforts by the Hibakusha, especially at least for the early stage of like after the bombing, Hibakusha, they were completely devastated, and I mean survivors, they were hurt both mentally and physically, and there was no enough food, so they were not in the situation to rebuild the city for a while.
Okay, Masako, we have one question from Ma Fernanda from Mexico that I'll read out because I think it sets us up nicely for the discussion on the TPNW. And the question is, opponents to the TPNW probably acknowledge the suffering of the people affected by nuclear bombing and testing, but that doesn't seem to touch them. Is there any specific message that Ms. Wada has for them?
Hi. Okay, so the核兵器禁止条約に反対している人たちっていうのは、その被爆者とか、広島、長崎の被爆者とか、核実験の被爆者のその苦しみを分かっているとは思うんですけれども、but, その実際にそれに対して、それに影響されていることはないという感じです。何かその強いメッセージとかありますか？そういう核兵器禁止条約に反対している人たちに対して、その被爆者からのメッセージを、クリアなメッセージ何かあったら最後に教えてください。
世論調査はですね、世論調査はもうすでに 75% は条約に参加すべきだって言ってるんです。
はい、
日本のね、
はい、
ですね。だけどそれは、まだ、 十分に知られてない被爆の実態というのを日本の国においてもまだ十分ではない、76年経った今でもですね、何が起こったかということを、まだ被爆者がいるのかというようなことを考えてる、思ってる人もいます。だけど 75% はもう条約に入るべきだと思ってるという。
So 75% of people in Japan support Japan joining the TPNW. But the problem is that there are still many people who really don't understand what actually happened to atomic bomb survivors. What really happened? What on that day? There are many people who really don't understand the real suffering of the atomic bombing survivors. 何かそのメッセージというか、
メッセージですね。だから私たちがやることとしては、もう本当に私みたいな親から聞いたことしか話せないんだけれども、本当にいろんなことをやっぱり知ってもらいたいということですね。そして自分たちのことではなくて、自分たちの日本の国だけではなくて、本当世界中の人たちが関わっているものであるということ、関係があるということを本当にしっかりと思ってほしいということです。だから一つの国だけではなく、世界中がこれで苦しむんですよということをしっかりと分かってほしいと思っております。
はい。The message the atomic bombing survivor really wanted to convey is that everybody all over the world really should understand the real suffering of the atomic bombing survivors, both Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and nuclear testing, because if they really understand the real suffering, they should be able to change their mind. Sorry, I might have edited a little bit. Sorry. Yeah, but the point is the importance of understanding the actual consequence of the use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wada, and thank you, Masako Toki, for facilitating this. I think the message is very loud and clear. And we're going to go into our panel discussion on the initiatives and activities leading up to the negotiations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, its main provisions and next steps. And I think Ms. Wada's message to frames this discussion very, very nicely. So let me then introduce our fantastic panel, a very distinguished group of experts in this field, and I will do so in the order in which I will ask them to make short presentations, about 10-15 minutes each, and then we will open the floor for discussion. So if you have any questions that you may wish to just type in the chat box, you can ask them live later on, but that will give the panelists also the opportunity to reflect on your questions. So first, let me introduce a dear friend that I haven't seen for many years, Ms. Toni Jacques. Toni is a true pillar in this field. I mean, if you want to know about someone who is a role model for young diplomats in the field of disarmament, then this is Toni. Toni is currently the counselor and political coordinator at the Mexican Permanent Mission in New York, and where her portfolio, of course, includes disarmament and security and many other issues. She held a variety of positions in the Mexican Foreign Ministry, and has been posted also to Geneva and many other Mexican delegations dealing with disarmament issues. I think we all want to listen to her, so I will also just wrap up by saying that she was instrumental in the second conference on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons that was held in Nayarit, Mexico. That was really a very important conference leading to the third conference that was held in Vienna, was the other gentleman, the gentleman with us, Mr. Alex Kmentt, who was instrumental in that conference. And so I will, before introducing Alex, let me also introduce Ambassador Elayne Whyte Gomez. Ambassador Gomez is, of course, from Costa Rica, and an equally impressive diplomatic career. Ambassador, we are very proud of Elayne. Elayne is a graduate from the Middlebury Institute, and she's also serves on the Center for Non-Proliferation's International Advisory Council. So I have to watch my words very carefully, since Elayne is on our board. But most notably, Elayne Whyte was the chair of the negotiating conference that led to the successful conclusion of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And she faced, and I've had the opportunity to have many discussions with her over the years, but we all know that she faced extraordinary pressures during that time, and yet skillfully and with grace brought that treaty to a successful conclusion. So Elayne, welcome. Then a very dear friend of mine, Mr. Alex Kmentt, Ambassador Kmentt, who is the Director for Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in the department at the Austrian Foreign Ministry, and importantly, the President-designate of the first meeting of state parties to the TPNW that will be held in January next year. Ambassador Kmentt has held many positions. He and I were colleagues at the CTBTO, where he was the special assistant to the executive secretary. He was permanent representative of Austria to the European Union. He held positions at the Conference on Disarmament. And I think, Alex, our interaction goes back, way back to the negotiations of the anti-personnel landmine treaty many years ago. So, Alex, very, very warm welcome to you. And finally, and if definitely not the least, Dr. Rebecca Gibbons. Dr. Gibbons is an associate with the Belfer Center project on managing the atom. And she's also an assistant professor at the University of Southern Maine. She has a very impressive resume. It's focused on nuclear non-proliferation and arms control. But she has a very interesting twist that I actually did not know, Rebecca, is that she taught after college at an elementary school in the Bikini community on Kili Island in the Marshall Islands. So if you have time at some point, Rebecca, I'd also like you to reflect on the impact of the testing that was conducted in the Marshall Islands, if you wish. So with that introduction, which was not as brief as I'd hoped, but I'm going to start to ask Tony, and then I will just ask after Tony to Elayne, then Alex, and then Rebecca to make their comments. Tony, please.
Thank you, John. And thank you for your kind words in presenting me, and thank you to the organizers. And it is so good to share this panel with very, very good friends, but also the opportunity to explain very, very briefly the road to the so-called humanitarian initiative and the TPNW to the students of the school, the summer school of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. So as I said, I am going to be very brief, and as Jean said, the previous presentation was a marvelous framework, although it is very heartbreaking to keep reviewing and revisiting these issues, but it is important not to forget that this is not what we are talking about. It is why we need to keep talking about this. So I thank Masako Wada and all the Hibakusha for their testimony and their help in this road to the TPNW. So I am going to start by saying that unfortunately this type of testimonies and this type of memories and this type of talks are reserved at the United Nations only for side events, mainly, and for events that are done by civil society. And I'm not saying that in a despective way, but the reality is that very, very seldom the Hibakusha and other survivors of nuclear weapons have the chance to give their testimony to delegations, to member states. And this is partly the beginning of the reasons how or why the humanitarian, so-called humanitarian initiative evolved in the way it evolved. So I wanted to say that from the beginning, and I am, of course, open to questions later. But let's start just by saying that the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is not addressed still properly with in-depth discussions at the United Nations. At the United Nations, we talk about what weapons mean, but not what weapons do. We talk about who has the weapons and who can't have the weapons. But we talk a lot about who who says that they deserve to have the weapons. Some of them say that they deserve to have the weapons indefinitely. We talk about who can't have the weapons, and there are instruments in place not to let them have the weapons. But we don't talk about what weapons do, what weapons have done, and we just keep this as a reference for a doctrinal or a narrative based on ideology, which is the deterrence point of view that you have talked about and you have touched in the course in other presentations. So because we don't talk about these issues in the UN, this has been a struggle, and it was until very recently that we started to talk about these issues at the United Nations fora. Before 2010, we can trace some of these arguments, of course, in the preamble of some treaties, like the Tlatelolco Treaty, like in the NPT preamble itself, and when we talk about the devastation that would visit mankind if nuclear weapons were used again. And that was changed dramatically, although not out of the blue or from one day to the other, in 2010. In 2010, the ICRC president, then President Mr. Kellenberger, gave a speech to the Geneva diplomats in which he brought again the need to talk about the impact of nuclear weapons from the point of view of the diplomats of the 21st century community. And this can be pinpointed at the beginning, in time of the developments that succeeded after that, and that have been called the humanitarian initiative. I keep saying that this is the so-called humanitarian initiative and have been called the humanitarian initiative because paradoxically enough, humanitarian initiative was not a name that was used by the proponents of this approach or by the countries that were championing these causes at the UN. I am very, very embarrassed to talk about these issues in front of my very good friend Alexander Kmentt, who has just published a wonderful book about this story, and that I would recommend that everybody who is interested in how multilateral processes are built reads. Everybody should read his book because it is about how to build a momentum for a process. And he very rightly pinpoints the beginning of the humanitarian initiative label by Ambassador Cornel Ferruta, who was the chair of one of the preparatory committees at the NPT, an ambassador from Romania, and he was the first one who said the proponents of the humanitarian initiative. So for the purposes of this very brief talk, let's call it the humanitarian initiative. Everybody knows what it is. I am going to explain a little bit more what it is. So these are the actions and the steps that a group of countries started to promote and give impulse at the United Nations in order to do three things. A lot of people think that the purpose was the prohibition of nuclear weapons, but it was not really that. It was first to highlight the fact that nuclear weapons and their actions and their effects are not really addressed at the United Nations, and that human beings must be at the center of the public policy in any case, and humanitarian disarmament actions have already been successful in doing that, in returning a debate to the human element of the disarmament discourse. Why do we do this? It's because we need to prevent the humanitarian impact of indiscriminate weapons. So that had already been successful in the processes to prohibit landmines, to prohibit cluster munitions. It was also the reason or the rationale for the CTBT negotiation, and it is very prominent in the CTBT text and also in the prohibition of chemical weapons and biological weapons. In fact, biological weapons are called abhorrent. That's the adjective that is used in the Biological Weapons Convention when we qualify biological weapons. Yet, by 2010, nuclear weapons were still considered legitimate by some sectors of the room. And if you hear some narratives in the media and from some states, they say that they are useful for security and that they are absolutely necessary for the security of the regions or of the states, regardless of the impact. So facing this narrative, we also have the counterpoint, which is 116 countries, like the Latin American and Caribbean countries that have already joined nuclear weapon free zones and that have abolished nuclear weapons regionally. So these counterpointing narratives was necessary to be highlighted at the United Nations. So the first reason was to address this facts-based narrative of what weapons do from the point of view of the countries that don't have nuclear weapons, and especially the countries that have already decided not to have them through different treaties, and then with a preventive approach, let's call it that way, that was emanated or based on the experience of the previous humanitarian treaties. So with that in mind and inspired by the ICRC point of view, some countries started to push for this type of narrative in the context of the NPT in 2010. The first time that the NPT process addressed this issue was in 2010 in a decisive manner in the declaration that was approved that year, expressing concern about the humanitarian impact or the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And after that, there was a series of statements in which we could see that most of the countries of the United Nations were concerned about this. But there was no place in the multilateral fora to address this issue from the technical point of view. So very quickly, I have to mention that in the years 2013, 2014, Norway, Mexico, and Austria prepared 3 conferences separately, but linked to some extent. And that's why you need to read Ambassador's Kmentt book, because that's the book about. That's what the book is about. So the 3 conferences were intertwined, but they were separately conceived. And the first conference initiated by Norway on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in March 2013 was focused on a facts-based discussion on the immediate effects of nuclear weapons. It was a very successful conference from the technical point of view. It was attended by 123 countries. I have to underline this because it was a conference outside of the United Nations that had not been programmed by the United Nations. So it was difficult for countries to decide to go out of the program, out of the calendar. So it was very successful to have that many countries. Not the nuclear weapon states, they didn't want to participate. They were invited, but they didn't want to participate. India and Pakistan participated. And the conference was also a showcase for a lot of projections from experts and from academia and from the civil society organizations that could make a point that usually, as I said before, cannot be done in front of the delegations of states. The conference of humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in Nayarit, the second conference that took place in February 2014, was focused on the global impact of nuclear weapons and the global effects of a possible detonation, either by intent or by accident. I have asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico to distribute to all the students the chair summary of that conference so that you read it, because that document that was published by the Mexican government under the responsibility of Mexico, it was not a negotiated document, really gave the way to what the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons meant in the multilateral fora. And I'm going to conclude with three major conclusions of that document so that we can talk about them later if you want, but also to give a little bit of an introduction to what my distinguished colleagues will talk about when talking about the treaty. So the first one, the first conclusion was that the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons was documented and was a concern on many levels from the point of view of the 21st century society concerns, such as environment, food security, and displacement, and health consequences, environmental consequences, but also from the point of view of the security concerns and legal concerns. Historically, we had seen that weapons were headed for disarmament or for elimination when they were previously banned or previously outlawed, as the document says. So the discussion on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons was the point of no return towards the explicit prohibition of nuclear weapons in a legally binding instrument. That was the conclusion, because so far, until then, as I said before, other weapons have been explicitly prohibited in international law, but not the nuclear weapons. So with the conference in Nayarit in 2014, and then the Vienna conference in 2014 too in December, that also included the legal aspect of nuclear weapons use and already existing legal prohibitions. The path was open towards thinking about why these weapons that are so devastating could not be legally prohibited from a preventative point of view. So I will stop here, and of course we will continue addressing this issue in the questions, in the answers and questions and answers, hopefully, and of course I am at your disposal for any doubt. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you very much, Tony, for a very, very important sort of contextual presentation, and it puts us really into the thick of things. So now my great pleasure to ask Ambassador Whyte to make her presentation.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate this opportunity, and I have shared the screen. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Oh, good, good. I have mastered technology. I'm very happy about that. I should graduate today, Jan. You can tell the Institute I double graduated today. I very much welcome this opportunity, not only to be amongst people that I cherish and admire very much for the work they have undertaken and on the personal level as well, but I really cherish the opportunity as well to be able to share the knowledge about the treaty with this new generation of Latin American diplomats. I think the Latin American region has actually contributed a great deal to international peace and security, among which is the contribution and the great role that was played for the strategic and fundamental role that the Latin American region played for the achievement of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I will, of course, make reference to the provisions and the negotiations, but I will take also time to highlight the different milestones in which the Latin American and Caribbean region contributed to this process. As I said, I think the each generation has played a specific role in history. We now have in place the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and the next generation of diplomats will have in their hands the challenge to make it flourish into a very vibrant regime that appropriately interacts with the rest of the architecture. So I think Tony's presentation was also a perfect introduction for my my remarks. She has pointed out and she has developed how the humanitarian impact developed. I would like to leave you with several messages about this process. First of all, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a point of arrival for a historic process, the process that started in 1945 with a call by the Hibakusha and the overall civil society in the international movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement to prohibit nuclear weapons so that all weapons of mass destruction would have a specific prohibition norm in international law. So it does comply with that historic aspiration, but it also is a point of arrival for a very successful point of arrival for the movement of the humanitarian impact. In 2010, as Tony was mentioning, a humanitarian perspective on nuclear weapons is born. And I would like to leave you, as I said, with two main messages. The first one is also taken by the speech given by the then president of the ICRC, of the International Committee of the Red Cross, in which I quote, he said, I quote, "The rights of states must yield to the interest of humanity." And this is very representative of the turn that the humanitarian impact gave to the understanding, but above all, the discussion, the international discussions about nuclear weapons. And the second one is this, that I consider the leitmotif, the most powerful statement of the humanitarian impact, which is the one that gave rise to this new paradigm, which is any use of nuclear weapons, any explosion would have catastrophic consequences for humanity and for the environment. So nuclear weapons should never be used again under any circumstances. And the only way in which we can be protected from any use is the total elimination. And to arrive at the total elimination, a norm that prohibits and stigmatizes nuclear weapons was a milestone that was fundamental to achieve. In that line, a whole new political movement and a new strategy were born that has been very well documented by Ambassador Kmentt. But I want to point out two aspects. The first one is that this new political movement and this new strategy was a combination of agency by by governments, but also by civil society and by science. There was a whole new and unprecedented institutional process that was developed within the framework of the UN. This is very important because, as Tony was mentioning, 2 other treaties that were negotiated before in the current of humanitarian disarmament had to be negotiated outside of the UN. This process also has this great advantage that it was mastered within, with a very well knowledge and sophisticated knowledge of the institutional structure, dynamics, and procedures of the UN. So the overall process was conducted in within the UN, of course, outside of the humanitarian conferences. I usually say that it is very important to have civil society and science incorporated in everything we do in the 21st century, because we governments usually are driven by the concept of national interest. But civil society, citizens from all over the world, and scientists need to represent the interest of humanity and the narrative of humanity. So we need to have this combination of governments and civil society working hand in hand, and science working hand in hand to generate change. I want to mention 5 resolutions by the United Nations General Assembly were adopted in this process from 2012 to 2016 that led the way and progressively developed the path at the institutional level to see the treaty become a reality. This was a process altogether of 10 years from the moment in which the president of the ICRC delivered that speech of the humanitarian impact, to the process in which the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force. It was 10 years. And there were 5 resolutions under the title of moving forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations, that each of them complied or met a specific objective. This is very important because one of the instruments that these resolutions or this movement utilized was the creation of open-ended working groups to discuss the issue of nuclear disarmament, how to move the needle in the international discussion of nuclear disarmament. This is very important. Why? Because there is, at the UN, there is a specialized body, which is the Conference of Disarmament, that has been paralyzed for decades because they make decisions on the basis of consensus. So what this strategic movement and group of people did was to take this process to the General Assembly, which is the universal body, because another problem that the Conference of Disarmament has is that it's only comprised of 50-something states. They are not elected. They are just there throughout history. So we cannot change them. So we cannot, for instance, the last enlargement was, I don't know how many, maybe 20 or something years ago, 20 or 30 years ago. So for instance, Costa Rica does not have a right to access that forum. So what this process did was to take the process away from this specific forum that was paralyzed and was not representative to the representative body, which is the General Assembly, and created ad hoc spaces where this issue was going to be discussed. And it is one within the open-ended working groups then in 2013 and 2016 that also all the discussion of the conferences was taken on board in a multi-stakeholder environment. And in 2016, that was the moment in which this open-ended working group reverted back to the General Assembly, saying or recommending that it was already time to move the needle and to convene already in 2017 a negotiating conference. So in 2016, this was taken to the General Assembly. and the General Assembly adopted the resolution that mandated the diplomatic conference in 2017. The Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, was awarded for ICANN in 2017, which is something that we need to acknowledge as well. That speaks of the interest that this process and the admiration that this process gained. The treaty entered into force in 2020, and the first meeting of state parties is going to take place in 2022. Let me just take some minutes to highlight some milestones or contributions from the LAC region, from the Latin American and Caribbean region. First of all, we already know about the historic efforts in the Tlatelolco Treaty and the existence of OPANAL, but the issue then of nuclear disarmament has always, Latin America and the Caribbean regions have never given up hope and given up agency to deal with nuclear weapons. So in 2011 already, the LAC region delivered a statement at the first committee of the 66th UN General Assembly, by which the 33 member states of OPANAL declared that they were prepared to negotiate a universal legally binding instrument that would prohibit nuclear weapons. In 2013, Costa Rica presided over the first open-ended working group in Geneva. In 2014, the Conference of the Humanitarian Impact took place in Nayarit in Mexico. There were, at the regional level, there was a very important and a strategic process to forge the unwavering political commitment of the Latin American region to move the process of multilateral negotiations. And each of the summits of the CELAC mechanism adopted a specific communique or declaration that dealt with the issue of nuclear weapons. And it was, so there was one in 2011, 2013, 2014, and 2015. In 2015, there was the summit in Belén in Costa Rica. There was a special declaration that on the urgency of a world free of nuclear weapons. That was the summit that endorsed the Austrian pledge that had come out of the Vienna conference. And by so doing, the whole of the Latin American region at the highest political level, that means heads of state and government, was already pouring all the political capital of the region into this process. And Ambassador Kmentt can comment on that because he was on the receiving end of that letter, and he can maybe make a reference to what it meant for Austria to receive the complete support and endorsement by a whole region at the highest level. And well, then in 2016, also the CELAC summit in Ecuador also adopted a special declaration on peace and nuclear disarmament. Also, I want to speak of another milestone in this process, which I don't know if there was referred to, but maybe I guess Ambassador Kmentt does develop in his book, the role of the Vatican's new doctrine in this process. We all know that the Vatican did change the doctrine because before they considered the use of nuclear weapons, of course, invalid, but after the role and the work undertaken by Latin diplomats, especially, I remember when Ambassador Lo Monaco told me that he was traveling to Rome to speak with the authorities in the Vatican. And so we now have, witness a completely change of paradigm also in the Vatican that was also a huge strategic support for the process. Another aspect is the two countries of the Latin American region, Brazil and Mexico, who were part of the core group that very skillfully mastered all this strategy within the framework of the UN. In 2016, in the open-ended working group in Geneva, also the LAC regions, the countries of the region played very prominent roles in the debates. the debates in Mexico, Jamaica, all the Latin American countries. At some point, also there was a procedural role that was played by the ambassador of Guatemala. When the report was, there was a vote, it was asked for the report. And so the ambassador of Guatemala very, very quickly said, so we're going to vote on the report. We might as well just bring back the original text or drafting that was proposed, so that the recommendation to the General Assembly was going to be even more straightforward. In the convening of the conference in 2017, there was a working paper 34. There was the one that presented the idea of already moving to the negotiation conference. And that was presented also by Brazil, Costa Rica, and Mexico. In 2017, the UN conference was presided by Costa Rica. And the post-conference, of course, there were many other moments in which the Latin American region continued on the political support. But I would like to mention the 2017 declaration by the Parlatino. That meeting took place in Panama in November of that year, in which the whole region not only welcomed the adoption of the treaty, but also encouraged all the parliaments to very fast adopt it and ratify it. And then, as in the role of having presided over the conferences, I also developed work with the Interparliamentary Union in 2017 and in 2019, so that we kept the momentum going and talked to many parliamentarians and lobbied greatly with parliamentarians to see the ratification process move forward. And last but not least, this is something interesting as well, both Jamaica and Honduras contributed with the 49th and 50th ratifications that were necessary for the entry into force of the treaty. Let me just, I like this very much because I like to put faces to this process and the ideas that I have spoken to you. We already heard Tony, who is a champion of this process, but I also want you to see, the moment in which in Geneva we all voted. For some reason, we were sitting in the same sector of the room. We all voted for the open-ended working group to take on board the recommendation to the General Assembly and have the conference in 2017. We all know the extremely strategic and brilliant role played by Ambassador Jorge Lo Mónaco of Mexico. We all know also the great voice that was heard in the room by the brilliant interventions of the Ambassador of Jamaica, Shona Kay, and also the role, as I just mentioned, played by Guatemala in the open-ended working group. As I said, I presided over the conference on behalf of Costa Rica. My colleague Norman Lizano was also pivotal at the expert level in moving the process as well. In the other picture, the third picture on the bottom line, I am with Marcela Zamora, who is now the head of Disarmament and Security at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica, who was absolutely strategic in complying with one of the aspects that is fundamental in all negotiation. All negotiations have the procedural, the substantive, and the psychological or personality dimensions of the process. And Marcela Zamora was absolutely instrumental in the negotiation of the rules of procedure and also in keeping the dialogue and the political and personal dialogue with the delegates. And to my right is Yoconda Ubeda, who is no longer with us, unfortunately. She was the one that delivered in 2011 the statement at the GA that said the Latin American region is ready to move with the legal prohibition of nuclear weapons. Then Ambassador of Ecuador, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, later became the president of the General Assembly, and in that role, she was absolutely supportive of the treaty. now I don't know where I am here. Well, also Paola Ramirez was absolutely strategic in the negotiations and towards the right also the ambassador of Brazil to the negotiation, Ambassador Patriota. So I wanted to leave you with some phases that I think it is important that we consider that we can have the most perfect plan designed, but we also need the operators. And here are the phases of the operators. You already saw Tony, but I wanted you to see at least some, because there are many other phases that are not here, but these are some of the phases of the operators that make this a reality. So let me go now to the premises of the negotiation. As I said, the resolution 71 to 58 was the one that mandated, that created the diplomatic conference. And the mandate had three pillars. The first pillar was to negotiate a treaty that had a categorical and comprehensive prohibition, but at the same time that led to the total elimination of nuclear weapons. That meant it was not a comprehensive treaty like the convention that Costa Rica had presented before that dealt with all the steps of the process, but it was a prohibition with pathways to the total elimination of nuclear weapons. So this was, I have to say, this was the most challenging part of the negotiation. Just to create these pathways was very fundamental. The second pillar was that the treaty had to complement the already existing architecture, including the treaty on the prohibition, on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, the NPT. And third, that the process had to be concluded as soon as possible. So there was a sense of urgency, and there was a mandate of urgency in the negotiations. The negotiations, first of all, I have to admit, the conference was very open and participatory. More than 100 civil society organizations, more than 130 delegations, scientists and institutions were part of the negotiations. And that created an environment that was, as I said, an expression of how these multilateral processes need to be conducted in the 21st century. Participatory and multi-stakeholder. So during the negotiations, there were very specific, especially in the first week, very specific mandates that the delegates expressed. First of all, that the treaty had to be of non-discriminatory nature in its legal obligations. That was the learned lesson from the NPT. No discrimination, all member states had to abide by the same legal obligations. The treaty had to establish a categorical prohibition at the same time that it complements the rest of the architecture, but it had also to include the threat to a prohibition to the threat of use of nuclear weapons. So this is fundamental because what is at the very heart of deterrence, of nuclear deterrence, which is the threat of use.
Elayne, sorry to interrupt. I have to ask if you could kindly wrap up. We are running over time.
Okay, so I'm going to move.
Apologies for that.
Yes, so I'm going to move to the main prohibitions that very much reflect the mandate of the conference. A new conceptualization of nuclear weapons is thoroughly developed in the preambular section, which actually builds the link and imprints the link with the humanitarian impact in the preambular section. The clear, strong, and comprehensive prohibition is in Article 1 that contemplates a wide range of activities that are related to the life cycle of nuclear weapons: develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess, stockpile, transfer, stationing, deployment. A whole range of activities are included in the prohibition or Article 1. The paths for the future and verifiable elimination and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons is contemplated in Articles 2 to 4. There is a very strong provision on safeguards, that this is a very important part of the treaty, that I also would like to leave this message with you. The safeguards provisions are very strong and built upon the NPT, but also on the existing protocols developed under the International Atomic Energy Agency. And what the treaty does is that it gives a legal, that the protocols, the safeguards are imprinted in protocols. And what the treaty does is that it gives them a legal stance in an international treaty. There's an enhanced institutional structure in Article 8 that allows the meeting of state parties to continue to develop the regime and gives the meeting of state parties the possibility to create additional protocols to continue on developing the other components of the irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons that are necessary to develop in the future. Article 5 states the obligations of the state parties to undertake appropriate measure, legal and administrative, to prevent and suppress of any of the activities. And there is also a new victim assistance and cooperation dimension. Article 6 and 7 develop provisions on assistance to victims and the environmental remediation of contaminated environments, and also contemplates the international cooperation to facilitate the implementation of the treaty. And Article 12, which is another innovation, is that Article 12 that deals with universalization establishes universalization as a legal obligation of member states. So all parties should engage with states non-party to the treaty to sign, ratify, accept, approve, or accede to the treaty with the goal of universal adherence of all states to the process. I think just to conclude that the treaty is not a milestone, it's a milestone in political terms, in institutional terms for the UN, in historical terms, as also it does render justice to the victims. And I think it opens a new era in multilateral nuclear disarmament. It opens a new era also in the way in which we approach the responses to the most important and pressing challenges of that humanity faces. Thank you, and I am sorry to go over the details and the time. You are muted. Let me just stop.
I am muted. Thank you very much, Ambassador Whyte, for your detailed and comprehensive presentation. We appreciate that. And I now ask Ambassador Kmentt, who will be chairing the first meeting of states parties. Alex.
Thank you so much, Jean. The screen is still shared. Maybe that
I am
could.
trying to see. I'm not fully created. Okay.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to participate in this discussion. It's a really great opportunity to speak to Latin American diplomats, and I just wanted to say that your region should be really proud of the role that diplomats from these countries have played, and of course the two speakers before me are prime examples of that. And it was also for me really some of the most gratifying professional experiences working cross-regionally, and of course specifically with colleagues from Latin American countries, Mexico, Costa Rica, Chile, Brazil, and others. I think really multilateralism at its best. So I'm extremely pleased to have the opportunity to speak. Jean has asked me to speak specifically on entry into force in the first meeting of states parties, so more the forward-looking aspect. But since Elayne has asked me on how the CELAC endorsement in 2015, how important that was. It was extremely important. I just wanted to very briefly, at the end of the conference in Vienna, because it was not a negotiating conference, little Austria issued a national commitment that because the risks of consequences are so grave and the risks of nuclear weapons are grave and the consequences are more serious than previously understood, it's important to fill the legal gap for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And we pledge to work with stakeholders, whoever who wants to stigmatize, prohibit, and eliminate these weapons because of the unacceptable humanitarian consequences. And we issued that, and we invited countries to join. And of course, some of the opponents thought that was really not particularly important. If a country like Austria pledges something, fine. But then a few weeks later, 33 heads of state and government suddenly said, well, that's a good idea. And that really made a big impact. And this Austrian pledge then was very soon renamed Humanitarian Pledge and was at the end of the day endorsed by over 130 countries, which of course was then paved the way in many ways. This commitment paved the way for the political will to negotiate the TPNW. So it was hugely important. And I think your region has been doing somewhat better on these issues than my region. So entry into force happened in January this year. Very important, 50 ratifications. The number 50 was Honduras in October, and 90 days later, the treaty enters into force, 22nd of January this year. It is extremely significant because, of course, by the entry into force, it is a legal reality that cannot be wished away, even if there are many actors who want to wish it away. And of course, there was a massive and continues to be a very significant campaign against the TPNW by the most powerful states who consider nuclear weapons still as absolutely central to their national interest, and did not look kindly at the loss of control that the TPNW represents, because the nuclear weapons discourse at the end of the day in multilateral fora certainly has been traditionally very much controlled by the countries that have these weapons in the way procedurally these fora are set up, which is essentially everything related to nuclear weapons requires on the consensus rule. And that sounds very good, but in practice we see very often that a consensus rule is tantamount to a veto mindset, or can lead to a veto mindset, and we have often seen that on nuclear weapons. Whereas the ability to vote usually facilitates consensus, but we have seen in the NPT and in the Conference on Disarmament times and time again that consensus is either not possible or leads to extremely watered down outcomes. So what we did is go through the most democratic body there is in the UN system, which is the General Assembly, where you can actually vote. And it was very hard to accept for the nuclear armed states that on the issue of nuclear weapons, a process was enacted by voting, representing the clear majority of states and also the clear wish of the international community to make progress. So the loss of control, I think, is one reason why entry into force and the TPNW in general was opposed. And then, of course, the humanitarian argument, the argument that these consequences are much graver than we've all thought, and the more you look at it, the more you understand how grave and how interconnected and transboundary these consequences are, and that the risks are manifold, very hard to control. They increase with new technologies and so on. So that with this type of argument, nuclear deterrence as a foundation of international security and stability looks extremely precarious. We knew that before, but the more you look at it from the angle of humanitarian consequences, what they actually do to people and the risks, the stronger this argument becomes. So entry into force was hugely important, and the campaign against the TPNW certainly continues, and of course it has an impact, because if the most powerful states tell countries that we really don't want you to do something, it does have an impact. Intimidation, of course, works, but there are also unintended consequences, and I tend to look at those, which is the more forceful the opposition is, the clearer it shows me that the arguments on which the TPNW is based are very profound and are very strong and have tremendous transformational potential. And if you actually look at the arguments that are made, they have been arguments of deflection, because the actual arguments on which the TPNW is based, which I just mentioned before, what is the impact of knowledge of humanitarian consequences and the knowledge of risks on the proposition that these weapons are a sustainable foundation of international peace and security? These arguments haven't been addressed by the nuclear armed states. So we're still waiting in a way. We've had the humanitarian consequences conferences, the three ones that Tony was talking about. Of course, the states were invited, but actually did not show up. Two nuclear armed states came to the last conference in Vienna, but actually didn't speak to the issue at hand. And to this day, I think we are waiting for a detailed engagement, other than a sort of general statement that, of course, the consequences is bad, but that's exactly why deterrence works. But I think the vast majority of non-nuclear weapon states to this day wanting to have a serious conversation about what type of security are we talking about and whose security are we talking about. I think that's important. So the treaty is now in force. It's not going away. There are actors that want to prevent progress, but there are also actors who want to see progress, and it's slowly growing. And we're preparing for the first meeting of states parties, which has to take place as per the treaty a year after entry into force. And I have the great honor to have been designated as chair of the first meeting of states parties. And it is, of course, a very important responsibility given the massive contestation around the issue. So there are actors who want this meeting to go badly. They want, so they are watching very carefully what we're doing. And I've been running these consultations now, of course, online due to the pandemic. It's therefore limited, and I look forward to autumn when hopefully we can have in-person meetings. But I have to say that these consultations have been going extraordinarily well, because the countries that have ratified actually all want this treaty to be successful and also want the first meeting of states parties to be successful. So what I can tell you about the consultation so far is that it's very clear that the states parties do want to continue to promote and focus on the arguments on the humanitarian consequences and risks, which is the very foundation of the treaty. And this is actually the argument for urgency behind anything related to nuclear weapons. So they want to focus very strongly on that. They want to, and part and parcel of that are the positive obligations in the treaty that Elayne has talked about, because for the first time, the TPNW actually contains provisions on victims of nuclear weapons and nuclear testing, and on environmental remediation from communities that have suffered from these weapons. So this is a long-term process, but the idea is to, through a legal instrument and through the framework that it provides, to actually for the first time focus on these issues properly, which in the NPT, for example, doesn't take place. Then we have a few items that were left over at the negotiations related to deadlines. If nuclear armed states join, we still have to set a deadline by which time the elimination of those weapons should be done, which is something that we want to focus on facts-based with scientific input. We want this to be a serious discussion and a serious, we want to demonstrate that we take the provisions of the treaty seriously. Another obligation of the treaty is on universalization. So we are obliged by the treaty to promote the treaty, and it means promoting the norm of the treaty and promoting the arguments of the treaty. So these are aspects that we'll focus on a lot. The prohibitions of the treaty, of course, are hugely important. None of the states that come to the first meeting of states parties are violating the prohibitions. So I think that is, of course, very important. But the focus is very clearly, there is a common sense of purpose to demonstrate that this is not a unserious exercise. Quite the opposite. It is countries, it is states that look at nuclear weapons from a legitimate security perspective, that they've given this proper thought, that they went through a proper process, both internationally and nationally, and that they are serious about implementing this treaty. And this is actually the most important thing that we can do at the first meeting of states parties, because by demonstrating the seriousness, by promoting the norm of the treaty, there I'm very optimistic in as far as the future is concerned. We're contributing extremely powerful arguments to the nuclear weapons discourse, and we provide a different paradigm to this issue. And after having worked for more than 20 years in this field, that is the only way to make change, is to change the way we think about nuclear weapons, and we have talked about nuclear weapons. So it is the TPNW, and the work we're doing is non-nuclear weapon states taking responsibility themselves, rather than in consensus for appealing to states that have these weapons, please do something. We've decided to let's see what we can do, and changing the discourse, changing the way we address these weapons, and taking charge to the extent that we can. Of course, we cannot disarm, but we can work on the legal parameters, and we can work on the discursive parameters. And I think that's what the TPNW is doing as an agent for change. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Ambassador Kmentt. That was a really powerful message. I fully subscribe, and I think that's a really good message for our younger diplomats, is to make a change and to change the discourse in the whole way that nuclear weapons are being perceived. So now we have our final speaker, and definitely not the least, Dr. Rebecca Gibbons. Rebecca.
Great, thank you so much. I'm honored to be amongst this company today, and I'm glad to be able to chat with you about these issues. I'm going to give another plug. Last time I didn't have the actual book, so I wanted to say to get this book, and it's helped me a lot. That's Ambassador Kmentt's book, and I do recommend it. I know we're short on time, but I did want to talk a little bit about the Marshall Islands, since I was asked. I could spend the whole 15 minutes on it, but I won't. So after college, I was a teacher on the island of Kili, which is one of the many islands in the Marshall Islands. It is the home of part of the population of displaced Bikinians. They were moved to Kili in 1948 after it was realized that the initial move that they had, that the people were not thriving, they were starving. And so they were moved to this island. It is a coral island. It is not an atoll, which means the people of Bikini were traditionally some of the best in the Pacific in terms of both sailing and fishing. And so they lost that traditional aspect of their lives in some ways by moving to this coral island where there's not that nice atoll where you can sail and fish. There is fishing, but it's much more dangerous. They've been treated quite badly, I would argue. They were told they could move back to Bikini in the Johnson administration, only to find out that there was still dangerous radiation on the atoll. And part of my job there was teaching social studies. So I did teach my young students, 3rd and 4th graders, about why they lived on this island and why they didn't live on Bikini, which their grandparents had told them was, this beautiful paradise. And I also just want to add that they are really double victims because now the island is getting washed over. It's flooding regularly. Their airstrip, which is the only connection to the outside world, is flooding regularly because of climate change. And so, I mean, it's unlikely that this island will even be able to sustain them through the next century on climate change. So, it's just like a really unfortunate situation, but I do like to talk about it because that is what got me into learning about nuclear weapons and pursuing a career where I research nuclear weapons, disarmament, and arms control. I think it's also important to point out that part of my history is also working for the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force at the Pentagon for almost 10 years. And so I worked in arms control. But what I wanted to say, and it relates exactly to what Ambassador Kmentt was just saying, is the role of ideas and beliefs. And so I got to experience firsthand the very strong socialization that is involved in working in the nuclear community in the United States, and particularly in Washington, D.C. And so I think that is the challenge. That's the real challenge in engagement, is thinking, there is just not, there's not a broad band of argument, or the window of discussion is not very wide. And so how do we get people going? How do we get people there thinking more about the humanitarian impacts in a real way, and not just, as we've talked about, saying we acknowledge that that's why deterrence works. We of course know about these things, but to really engage on these issues. And that's a challenge I think about a lot, because I myself was so socialized into that deterrence environment for so many years as a young person. All right, so that's the end of that, and I will try to get through the rest of my comments quickly. So my goal today was to talk to you about putting the TPNW and the humanitarian effort into context, and particularly into the NPT context. So I wanted to go back a little bit and talk about the history of the NPT, and to note that the beginning of the nuclear age, 1945, was also when the U.S. was at the height of its power, its material power in the world. And at this time, the U.S. sought to create, with its allies, many different multilateral institutions, right? So whether related to economics or the security in the UN, this was a time of institution building. And yet it wasn't a time of successful institution building for nuclear weapons. It would take the US and the Soviet Union until the 1960s to really come together and say that they needed some sort of treaty for non-proliferation. And why did they come to that realization? Well, part of the reason is because some of their allies had since proliferated, right? So we have the UK getting nuclear weapons, France, and then China. And these countries, once they got nuclear weapons, started to behave a little bit independently of their patron allies. And that was seen as problematic. And I think France is the best case for a country that was behaving independently once it had its own nuclear weapons. There was also, of course, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. But I would argue that it took them a long time to come to this realization. And once they realized that they had a strategic interest, right, a strategic interest in non-proliferation, is when we get the NPT. And that it was largely written, as we know, by the Soviet Union and the US, and that the original draft that those two superpowers put forward didn't include Article 6, right? The Article 6 disarmament commitment. This was something that allies and other countries persuaded the superpowers to put into the treaty. And of course, this article has been brought up at every review conference since the first one in 1975. Disarmament has always been a sticking point in this treaty. And I would argue that's because the real motivation behind the NPT from the superpowers was non-proliferation, was making sure that other states don't have these weapons. And so even though now we talk about this treaty as having these three pillars, right? Non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful uses, for the US, and I would say for the P5 as a whole, the strategic focus, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, right? The strategic focus has always been on non-proliferation. And so if we go back in history, despite the fact that Article 6 was included in the NPT, the US and the Soviet Union would go on to have over 70,000 nuclear weapons at the height of the Cold War. And of course, it's important to note when we're thinking about Nagasaki or thinking about Hiroshima, these weapons are much more powerful than those weapons. And so we're not talking about the same thing even. And so when the end of the Cold War, we see this revived hope for Article 6 in the NPT, and that it will now be on a path towards disarmament now that this Cold War contest is over. But we really see this pattern, and I've written about this before, so I'm not going to go into it a lot of detail, but we do see this pattern of raised hopes for disarmament only to be dashed, and then raised hopes for disarmament only for those hopes to be dashed again. And I think a particular low point was the 2005 NPT review conference. And that is the one where the US wouldn't agree to the 13 steps that it had agreed to in the previous 2000 review conference, right? And so the idea taken from that conference is, if in this forum, if we can't get the great powers or the nuclear weapon states to agree to what they agreed to just 5 years ago, then how are we really going to make progress on disarmament? And it was that conference that catalyzed the International Physicians to Prevent Nuclear War to start ICANN in Australia. It also led to many diplomats thinking, what are we going to do to maintain the NPT in the long term if we're not making progress on disarmament? So I see this as sort of the latter half of the 2000s. After 2005 was when you'd start to see a lot of new thinking. And of course, the humanitarian effort emerged from some of that new thinking. And we do get this great linkage between civil society represented by ICANN and working with state actors and supported by state actors. And so I guess I would say that part of the loss of control that Ambassador Kmentt mentioned is that the US and these powerful states have been the ones traditionally that have promoted norms, have promoted new multilateral institutions to fit their perspective of what global order should be or how global order should serve their interests. And the TPNW really counters that idea that they're the ones in charge of global order. And so we've seen, in my most recent area of study is to kind of catalog and put a framework around the ways that the P5 have tried to undermine the TPNW. And so that's using their rhetoric to denigrate the treaty, repeatedly saying this treaty is not going to be effective, it's harmful, saying they're never going to be a part of it, saying that their method of nuclear reductions is the only one that's realistic and practical. And then in addition to words, we've seen deeds. So the letter to NATO members in 2016 telling them to vote no on the General Assembly resolution on commencing negotiations, snubbing of the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in 2017. There's the example of the US telling the Swedish government to forget any military cooperation in the future if it joins the TPNW. I think the creation of the Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, known as CEND, was another way to try to divert attention and provide another opportunity for allies to say they were working on disarmament without having to go towards the TPNW. We've seen France try to get the Pope to change his language. There was the US letter already mentioned that came out last fall telling countries that had joined the treaty that they had made a strategic mistake and please leave the treaty. And then there's lots of rumored instances. As an academic, I would love to get people on the record telling me these things, but it's not always easy to admit or wise necessarily, but there's lots of rumors of different countries being pressured. So if a P5 country has a historical relationship with a certain country, threatening trade or other benefits for joining. And so I think it's obvious that the P5 are having a very difficult time with this treaty. And that I think we're just going to have this contest of norms in the foreseeable future, this norm of non-possession versus this norm of selective possession or this norm of deterrence, right? There's not lots of norms that uphold ideas about nuclear weapons. And so That said, I do want to say that I do think we've seen a softening of rhetoric, and I expect to see a softening whenever the Biden administration does eventually talk about nuclear issues, which, there's been a lot of domestic politics to deal with. And I think with the move of the RevCon now potentially to January, I think we won't hear a lot even anytime soon. But I do expect that we'll continue to hear the P5 say that this is not customary law, because they don't want it to be customary law. And part of the process of making sure it's not is to be kind of issuing their protests against this being customary law. So even though the rhetoric might be more understanding, I think we're still going to see that push to say that, this isn't the way forward. And so to just end where I started, I think the tricky part about engagement is really trying to get people who are kind of the insiders in the nuclear sphere to kind of think more about humanitarian effects. And then also, of course, to get the public on board. And that almost is just as big of a challenge because our public is so distracted by so many different issues. And so can we get a nexus of kind of thinking about anti-colonialism, anti-racism, climate change, and anti-nuclear weapons, and get all of those people working in the same sphere, because there is overlap, right? That's kind of what my hope is for how this moves forward. And so we have time for questions. I will end there. And thank you again for having me.
Rebecca, thank you so much. That was truly inspiring. And so were all the other three presentations. Participants, I've got to tell you that I have sat through many courses and panels, and this is truly one of the most inspiring ones. I really would like to thank our four panelists for their presentations. And we've gone over time, and I'm taking the liberty to extend the time even more before we take a break, not to lose the momentum. And I do want to recognize Ms. Masako Wada. It is almost 1:30 a.m. in Tokyo. So she's still with us, and we look forward, obviously, to her continued participation. So the floor is now open. The virtual floor is now open for questions and comments. So please raise your hands. You have a unique opportunity to engage these four experts in this very important field. Right, well, people are thinking, maybe I'll use the prerogative to get the ball rolling. So I'm going to ask the panelists to kind of look in a bit of a crystal ball here and be realistic when you do that. Is, the conference first meeting of states parties is coming up. The emphasis on the shifting of the paradigm has been emphasized, the continued focus on the humanitarian aspect, the context within the NPT. If we look forward a year from now, where would you like us to be in terms of this treaty? The engagement, of course, with non-nuclear weapon states are important, and the obligation in the treaty to do so and continue to promote the treaty is important. But how can we engage especially the nuclear reliant states, the states that enjoy the nuclear, or that are covered under the nuclear umbrellas? So if you wish to start with that, and while participants think about other questions. Tony.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and immediately answer because because of my presentation that is not directly related to the first meeting of states parties, I just want to give a couple of comments regarding your question. First of all, the relationship with the nuclear weapon states is important to signal. But I want to share with the students of the summer school that it is preferably to live, or at least from my point of view, to live in a world where nuclear weapons are prohibited. And even though they are still existing. there is a lot of narrative challenge to the TPNW, saying that this treaty is not going to eliminate any nuclear weapon, and I think that that is partially true. It is the first step towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, and that is going to be a long process. But the focus of the treaty is to prohibit a weapon that is devastating and that should be prohibited by international law. And that is what we are having right now. I wanted to say that because nuclear weapon states, unfortunately, don't have a very good record of adhering to international law of other issues related to other issues. Some of them yes, some of them no. So this should not be a disappointing fact. This is just a fact that if we wait for all of them to participate in treaties, maybe there wouldn't be any treaty at all. So we should look at the facts from a serene point of view. And my last comment regarding this issue is that 1 year from now, what I would like to see is a successful conference of the meeting of the states parties that has fulfilled its purpose and mandate, but also that the NPT has addressed once again the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, because that is the issue that we have not been able to address constantly in the NPT. Thank you.
Alex, thank you, Tony. Alex?
Thank you. It's always easy for me to speak after Tony because I can always agree with what she said. If you want to get rid of a weapon, you have to start with a prohibition, because it's the actual will. And that's what had happened with other weapon systems, biological weapons, chemical weapons, anti-personnel lines, cluster munitions. States that want to get rid of a weapon, they start with a legal basis. So the TPNW is the framework. Of course, it's very contested, but the fact that it is contested shows that the actual will is not there. And I think it's very important that the TPNW makes this clear, because that goes both ways. It goes in terms of where I want to be. I think, where I want the treaty to be is the recognition by states that actually really want to get rid of these weapons, that they should join the TPNW. I think that's important. And the other aspect is what I've alluded to in my presentation, is that we've actually haven't had the discussion proper with countries that actually want to keep this weapon, apparently, or that still believe they need this weapon, on the arguments of the treaty. So I want to have this engagement. We had there were very interesting set of polls in Europe, in nuclear dependent states, showing that clearly the overwhelming majority of the population is in favor of the TPNW and nuclear disarmament. So I want to see this broadened societal debate about these issues. And there again, taking the discourse is the important thing. If you have a nuclear weapons discourse that is full of language that is not understandable, that takes place in fora only limited to security policy experts, it takes place without participation of the society. And the humanitarian arguments and risk is something that can connect to people. So I think that is what I want to see, is more of this engagement. And then in a way you can say, quite frankly, it doesn't actually matter whether states join the TPNW, because as long as they engage in the arguments and then do something, well, that's fine. So let's see that. I think that's the sort of transformational power that I think the TPNW has. The TPNW is not a goal in itself. The TPNW is a discursive lever to make change happen, and I think that's where all these steps are so important now. Every ratification, even the smallest state that ratifies, demonstrates that the norm against nuclear weapons and the practice of nuclear deterrence is getting stronger. Every panel discussion where these arguments are made is an opportunity to engage. I think that's why the TPNW is so important. That's what I want to see more, and coming out of the also the NPT, as Tony said. Yeah, we will use the TPNW to make the humanitarian arguments there. So all these opportunities, hopefully, of course, that's we don't have a guarantee, but that's what the TPNW offers now, this kind of new framework and new opportunities to make these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Elayne?
Thank you. I agree with both Alex and Tony. And I would add that I would like to see, especially the countries of the LAC region, to continue on the ratification process, and to see in a year all of the countries in the region become state parties. And I would like to see countries engaging in Article 12, in activities of Article 12, promoting the discussion about nuclear disarmament and the treaty itself. But as Alex said, I think but countries engaging in Article 12 in activities of Article 12 is going to contribute to this overall discussion. I think something that is very good that is started to happen some years ago was to see such ownership of the issue. Think about other fields of the issue of climate change, to see such ownership in civil society, in citizens, and seeing how they need to contribute to make countries take the measures or the policies that need to be taken to address climate change. In terms of nuclear disarmament, I think engaging in Article 12 activities is going to give more prominence to the discussion. And also, I'd like to see more interaction with the issue of climate change, because those are the two existential threats that exist. And it's Rebecca was pointing something out that's very interesting. When most of the countries that are non-nuclear, our experts are not focused only on nuclear weapons. We have to deal with many issues of security. So we have the advantage of being able to put all the pieces together. So for instance, if we're confronted with the issue of nuclear weapons, it is very easy to see how a single detonation would trigger the extinction of species. That is part of what's being discussed in other fields about about preserving the environment or the planet. So for us, it is much done on a regular basis to put the dots together. And something I would like to see in a year time is more efforts to put the dots together between climate change, the need to preserve the planet and the environment to sustain human life, and the issue of climate change, and to see the security and defense establishments to take more on board the issue of environment and environmental. There is an initiative of greening. I heard this some time ago, greening defense policies. I think that we need to put that those fields closer together. And I would like to see many academic settings and environments helping in that regard.
Thank you, Elayne. I don't know, Rebecca, do you wish to weigh in there? And there's also a question that was posed to you that was asking, what is the reason for the negotiations in 2000 changed so drastically, in your reference to I think the 2005 NPT review conference?
Yeah, I'll let more questions be answered, but I did answer that on chat briefly, and a lot of it is the difference between the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration, and feelings about the CTBT. Yeah.
Okay, I see a number of questions. Let me just say that we have more than 80 participants on this call, which is fantastic. If you consider we have about 32 course participants, and I know we have 13 of our undergraduates and of course our panel, but I really also would like to welcome everyone else who signed on for this important panel. And with that, also encourage anyone, including our students that are online, to ask questions. This is a very unique opportunity. So I see Fernanda and Uriel. Please, Fernanda, go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Imogen, and thank you everybody for the exciting presentations. I'm gonna mispronounce your last name, Ambassador Kmentt. I know, I'm sorry. My first question was to you, but then I noticed that Ms. Wada is still online. So I would very much like to hear her ideas on the same question. What is the outcome? What is your expectation a year from now, that if the review conference takes place next January, where are we gonna be at that moment? And for you, Ambassador Kmentt, what would be the first question that you would pose to the floor on that first day in the conference?
I'm going to ask let a few more people ask questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Uriel and then Enrique.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentations. My question is related on what Rebecca mentioned about the use of nuclear states of this permissive speech, that nuclear weapons are still, they have still a use in the world. And I think they rely on this speech because they oftenly use the advice or opinion of the legality of the threat of or use of nuclear weapons of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So my question is if there is any initiative probably that could try to change the opinion of the ICJ based on the TPNW. Thank you.
Thank you, Uriel. Enrique and then Sophia, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond.
Yeah, so I have two questions actually. So the first is reading the TPNW Article 4 says that the state shall designate a competent international authority that shall supervise nuclear weapons dismantlement. And I assume that this provision is in case a nuclear weapons state decides to join the treaty. But anyway, my question is, was the designation made already of that competent international authority? And my second question adds up to Jan's question and also Fernanda's question. I mean, 5 decades have passed since the NPT entered into force. And yesterday we talked about how it has been successful because it did prevent more countries to have nuclear weapons and it decreased the numbers of nuclear weapons worldwide. So traveling in time a little bit more than just a year, in a 50-year time from now, how do you think the TPNW will impact disarmament and non-proliferation, and what needs to happen for you to think and believe that the TPNW was successful in a 50-year time? Thank you.
Thank you. Your crystal ball has just gotten much bigger. Sophia.
Hi, thank you. My question is on, it's pretty clear from both all of your speeches and just the TPNW that one of the most key aspects of this was how inclusive and diverse just the participants in the negotiation process were. I'm wondering if there were any specific steps that were taken to make that process of the negotiation as inclusive and equitable as possible, not just in which countries were represented and included in the process, but also in other aspects such as gender diversity.
Thank you. We have a series of very interesting questions. May I ask who of the panel would like to go first? Tony.
First, just to address Enrique's very good questions, and thank you for placing that question. In 50 years' time, of course, we cannot have a crystal ball, and let's not speculate, because we are promoting a facts-based discussion. So let's go back to what has happened with the other treaties of humanitarian disarmament. So I'm just going to give you one example. Maybe it's an overstretch, but it's a basis of an opinion. So in the years 1997, afterwards, when the Maine Treaty was adopted, the talk of the possessors and the users of these weapons was a little bit similar to the narrative that they are using against the TPNW. It was a legitimate treaty that was negotiated outside of the UN with civil society participation. So it was like the devil. And it was negotiated without the endorsement of the United Nations, etc., etc. Nevertheless, that treaty entered into force and immediately started to demonstrate the value because millions and millions of landmines were destroyed. So let's fast forward to the third conference, review conference of the Anti-Personal Landmine Treaty. The United States participated in the Mozambique conference as an observer of the conference. And they said, well, they never said, oh, we love the treaty. This is one of the best things that has happened. They will never say that, and they never said that. But they participated as an observer, and they said that they were setting into motion some legislative harmonization issues, so that maybe in the future they could envisage joining the treaty. But in the meantime, they were going to give some money to the programs of clearing and stockpile destruction of some countries, because that was useful for security purposes. So another example is we had the Cluster Munitions Convention in 2000, entered into force in 2010. After that, there was a confrontation between Georgia and Belarus. Neither of these countries has joined the Cluster Munitions Convention. Nevertheless, they both explained very, very lengthily to the world that the cluster munitions that they were used were not in their possessions, in their possession as states. So what I'm saying is that we have seen in the past that prohibitions based on the humanitarian impact of these very indiscriminate weapons serves as first of all, as a very high legal standard. Second, as a stigma of the weapon. And the third impact is that it sets into motion some linkages between the security concerns of the users and producers of these weapons, in the case of the conventional weapons, and the rest of the world. So what I think, based on these historical examples, is that at least in 50 years' time, it's going to be very difficult for states to talk about nuclear weapons as legal weapons anymore. So I am not saying that this is going to change completely the world, but at least it will have changed the dynamics of the past 70 years, in which many countries advocate for the use of nuclear weapons even as legal weapons. So this is one issue that, from the point of view of the countries that have foregone the nuclear option, is disgraceful. But also, it has been disgraceful from the point of view of the victims, as Masako very, very well explained. So I think that is going to be one of the measures of success in 50 years' time. Even if there are no, I mean, if I don't want to be so pessimistic, but even if no other variable changes and there are no more states parties or whatever, this is already a change into motion that we can see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I mean, I'd like also for others to comment on, I mean, I really appreciate your reference to the Anti-Personnel Landmine Treaty and how this evolved, because what I find very attractive about the TPNW is the foresight of the negotiators to include in Article 6 the whole issue of victim assistance and environmental remediation in Article 7 with international cooperation, which kind of paves the way. And Alex, whether is this something that you foresee that in the first meeting of states parties could be kind of seen, is this a way to engage even those who are opposed to the ban on nuclear weapons, but there is a way for them to get involved? I also recognize Ms. Wada had her hand up. So in the interest, given that it's quite late there, so with the agreement of the other panelists, I will ask her if she wishes to ask a question or make a comment.
さっきの質問についていいですか？雅子さん、よろしいですか？はい。来年の締約国に会議までにどうなっていったらいいかという質問でしたね。はい。はい。何回も今まで外務省との話し合いを私たちもしてきました。それで、これまで外務省の答えはいつも CTBT ですね。と、それからカトフ条約。それを先にやること。そして、あれですね、TPNW はまだ時期尚早だとずっと言い続けてきました。そこまでお願いします。
So responding to one of the questions, asking Ms. Wada about her expectation 1 year after the state parties meeting of the first of all, the atomic bombing survivors have been talking with the Japanese Foreign Ministry, asking them to join TPNW or at least participate in the meeting. But they always said the priority for Japan is first CTBT and FMCT, and it's premature for Japan to talk about TPNW. She still have a little bit of things to.
そして、条約が発効した途端にですね、外務省は NPT が大事だと言い始めました。はい、どうぞ。
However, right after the entry into force of the TPNW, the foreign ministry said, now the most important thing is NPT.
だけど NPT には日本は入っていますけれども、いろんな懸念があります。プルトニウムをたくさん持っているということも NPT に違反しているということです。
Although Japan is part of NPT, but there are still some concern. One of the concern is Japan possesses quite a large amount of excess plutonium.
それはもうすでに違反しているということですよね。そして、NPT が大事だと言って何をするかということは本当にしっかりと橋渡しをしてくれるのかということが大事だということ。
So while Japan said the NPT is important, but the Hibakusha and the civil society members are concerned how Japan's government can play a role as a bridge builder, as the government often said, the role of a bridge builder, what they can do.
私たちの気持ちというのは、日本が核の傘から抜けるということです。一国の比較の国を作る勇気を持つということです。
それが一応コンクルージョンでしょうか。
そうですね。はい。
はい、はい、わかりました。So we Hibakusha really hope that Japan is going to get rid of a nuclear umbrella and Japan is going to be the nuclear weapon-free status. That's the wish of the atomic bombing survivors. Thank you.
それでもみんなの指導の大きな力になるというふうに思います。
So if Japan takes such a step, this is going to be to create huge momentum for the TPNW. いや、よろしいでしょうか。
はい。
いいですか。すいません。はい。
Thank you, Ms. Wada. I think that is such an important objective. So I wish Ambassador Kmentt well in reaching out to do that. Any other responses to the questions? Alex.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm not going to attempt to answer all questions. Picking up again on what Tony has said, I think the TPNW is important on the legal side, of course, being a treaty, but it's also the legitimacy of nuclear weapons and the practice of nuclear deterrence that is crucial. The argument that it's making, which of course goes beyond the pure legal aspect. So we have countries that from a legal point of view have very clearly positioned themselves as persistent objectors, which means they have said they are not bound by this treaty, and they will not be bound by this treaty. And until they ratify, it's very hard to make the argument that they will be, unless the number of countries that have joined the TPNW becomes so great that you can make the argument that it's customary international law, which is very difficult. But it is the legitimacy of the nuclear weapons argument that is equally addressed by the TPNW. So it's legal and political. I think that is important. And also the point that I've made in my presentation, what is responsible behavior? When you deal with nuclear weapons, what is responsible behavior with nuclear weapons, and what is responsible behavior for states that do not have nuclear weapons but are concerned about nuclear weapons? I think these are all important aspects. Then a question was asked about the international competent authority in Article 4, which of course is foreseen in the treaty when a nuclear armed state joins. So the actual details of that are not specified in the treaty because there is no nuclear armed state joining at the moment, which of course can change any time, so we may have to accelerate. But no, I'm joking. The first meeting of states parties will address this issue and will set in motion, that's I think I can say from the consultation so far, a very detailed process of what such a competent authority would have to do, what its mandate would be, and what the technical aspects are that are required. So it goes to what I said before, that states parties want to address all these aspects that they have to implement in the most serious way possible on a facts-based and science-based basis. Then the question on the ICJ was asked, which of course the ICJ advisory opinion in 1996, one of the arguments that was made was that there was no comprehensive legal prohibition in place for nuclear weapons, which of course is different now. But I'm not aware of any initiative to take the issue back to the ICJ at the moment. And personally, I think it would be difficult to do that. I think it's much more the political legitimacy aspect that is where the TPNW has to make the point vis-a-vis states that currently don't support it. And then on the question of Japan and other observer countries, the Secretary General of the UN is the depository. All states of the UN have received an invitation. So the treaty is open and has always been open. And of course, all those states have to make a decision whether or not they participate. While it's probably unlikely that nuclear armed states will participate, I'd be very interested to see the discussion in nuclear dependent states and specifically Japan, for example. The TPNW is based on a humanitarian argument, which is, of course, resonates extremely forcefully in Japan. Japan has made it clear that for the moment they do not want to ratify the treaty, but I find it politically very hard to argue not to engage as an observer in a framework that is so clearly founded on the humanitarian consequences argument, and specifically Japan as the only country where nuclear weapons have been used in conflict and where there is such a strong civil society interest in this issue. So I very much hope and in a way count on the active role of civil society in Japan, but it's not just Japan. That of course goes for many other countries as well, but maybe specifically for Japan. And then the inclusivity question was asked, and I think and you, Jean, and Tony referred to the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention. These are treaties that have looked at weapons not purely from a military security perspective, but from a human security perspective, and have been open to broad input from a breadth of actors. And I think that was the success to connect the landmines issue to the wider public. The same goes for the cluster munitions issue, and there are other examples as well. So the TPNW followed this example by being inclusive. The multi-stakeholder dimension that Elayne has mentioned, I think was very clear. The model that states that supported this approach wanted to follow, to bring in expertise from a broader set of actors, not just deterrence theorists, for example, but we had in Oslo, we had and in Nayarit, we had people from the WHO, from UNHCR, we had people talking about food security, we had medical expertise. And if nuclear weapons, the consequences are addressed from this broad range of actors, the discourse changed. So that was a very deliberate approach, because the approach was to try to change the way we talk about these weapons. So you need to make it inclusive. And of course, the rules of procedure, first in the open-ended working group, but then in the treaty negotiations, and we will now negotiate the rules of procedure for the first meeting of states parties. The ambition is to be as inclusive and modern and commensurate to a 21st century way, multi-stakeholder way of approaching a global issue like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I will come back a little bit later. I want to hear Elayne, but I want to reflect also on your reference to the Oslo negotiating conference of the Anti-Personnel Landmine Treaty, and especially how this relates to the TPNW. Elayne.
Yes, I want to refer to the question posed by Sophia about diversity, not only in terms of participation, but also in terms of voice. I mentioned that at the beginning. Alex has also elaborated on that. 21st century challenges require a completely different approach to building the solutions, because the problems are very complex in nature. We need to bring together all the visions to the same problem, now not only one. So one of the aspects that is fundamental, is down very center stage in the international discussion, is the participation of women, indigenous populations, and all segments, pretty much all segments of society, to be engaged in the discussions for two reasons. The first one is that you need to have the visions, the different visions. The more ample the angle that you have, the less likely you're going to be to make mistakes, to put it that way, the more likely you will be to design interventions that are going to be good and they're going to work properly. For instance, in the case of the participation of women in the TPNW negotiations, not only there were a lot of women delegates, but there were many women heads of delegation and many women in charge of fundamental components of the negotiation. Like if we look at the overall process, the president of the negotiation was a woman. The official that represented the link towards the formal UN structure was a woman, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu. The leaders of the civil society were women, and also some specific negotiations. For instance, Articles 2 to 4 were those negotiations were chaired also by a woman, and so they were participatory and diverse, not only in terms of the presence of different people, but also in the possibility to engage and have an impact in the process. And that is something that is being discussed at this moment in the issue of the agenda of women, peace, and security is to have more women engaged in the discussions of traditionally male-dominated areas such as security and disarmament. This is of extreme importance because we need to change the old paradigms of conflict, war, and use of force and violence. And we can only achieve that if we bring other people in the room, because if we are only having men discussing the issues that they have forged for centuries, we need to bring more different ways of working methods, and also how different ways of incorporating visions and solutions. So I think we did the right thing at the conference, and it was actually you could see that in the results. And the last thing I want to make reference to the 50-year period that was put on place. It is true that the impact of the norms have to be measured in a longer period of time. I am completely sure, not only because I believe in the work that we have done, but also if you look at history, the only constant thing in human history is change. So if you look at the history of international relations, at some point, nuclear weapons are going to be superseded, or they are going to be useless at some point. I hope it's not because there is going to be another use, but I am sure that the history, the evolution of international relations is we're going to start seeing at some point a decrease in the role of nuclear weapons, and hopefully an elimination. And in forging processes of change, both ideas and perceptions interact with social dynamics. That has been the case. Tony already elaborated on other disarmament regimes, but we can also look at other examples such as slavery, decolonization, and other historic processes that dealt with very entrenched human behaviors. How having a norm did help in the process of social change. I mean, it is sometimes we forget about that in apartheid as well. So there are many instances in which we see the mutual reinforcement of norms and social change. And that I hope this is going to be the case as well in the long run.
Here to that, Elayne, thank you. Rebecca,
yeah,
the last hurrah here.
Okay, I'll be quick.
No, go ahead.
On the ICJ comment, I think it's interesting. I've interviewed a lot of people, both in the P5 and people part of the TPNW or promoting the TPNW, and all of the ICJ comments are always from the P5. So there is a real concern that is really what's at work here, and that is the next part of the campaign. And so it tells you something about the value of international law and the respect for international law, if that's the real concern, that there's going to be an opinion that says even the possession, not just the threat of use, is illegal. And so it's interesting to hear Ambassador Kmentt say that you don't know of any effort towards that, because that certainly is a fear, I think, in nuclear weapon states. And then the comparison between landmines and cluster munitions and nuclear weapons, I think it's a tough one for the P5. If you think about the Obama administration, they softened their rhetoric about both cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines, saying that they would try to eliminate it just to certain areas, for the landmines just to the DMZ and Korea. But we still saw very harsh rhetoric in the Obama administration against the TPNW. And so that is a way that there was continuity between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, even though there were people in the Obama administration who have said that they were sympathetic and didn't necessarily like how it was handled in terms of the humanitarian conferences. And so I think it's the idea that the nuclear weapons provide existential deterrence to not only the US, but the US allies that's going to be very hard to change over time, and is what's going to be necessary, I think, over time. And then I just wanted to point out there the role of allies, because as long as allies are saying that they need these weapons and they need protection, and there's a potential threat of proliferation if they're not protected by nuclear weapons, then it's going to be very hard to reduce numbers of nuclear weapons. And so I think what we're seeing in a lot of countries is splits between ministries of defense or ministries of foreign affairs, where you see people promoting disarmament on one side, and then you have the MODs, the defense people, saying, no, we need to have these weapons. And I think that's happened in Japan with certain nuclear weapons being Japan's weapons, the TLAM and the debate. And so the allies really have a role. I mean, I think at some point, some ally will say, we don't want to be we want protection, but we don't want to be under the protection of nuclear weapons. And that will eventually happen, and that will lead to change. That is all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to have to close this session because I'm thinking I'm imposing on our panel as well, but it is also very late. And again, Ms. Wada, we're so proud of you that you're still with us at 2 in the morning. So let me. I just want to make one quick comment, because this came out also in Alex's point, but I think all the panelists, or the diplomatic panelists, will relate to this, and I know that Rebecca is aware of this as well, is for the benefit of our younger diplomats, since this is a training course, is that in your diplomatic career, as you get involved with initiatives, there will be opportunities for you to take bold action. And the individuals here have taken those actions, they and their countries. And you should seek those opportunities. It is not easy, because you will be faced with opposition. You will be faced with opposition from within your own ministry. You'll be faced with opposition from within your own region, and even more daunting, you'll be faced with opposition from the most powerful nations. I remember Ambassador Kmentt and I sitting at a cafe that we've many times did in beautiful Vienna, talking about this, is what is going to happen once this Austrian pledge hits the table, and as he explained, and had it not been for CELAC, who knows? We were in a situation with the New Agenda Coalition, with Mexico and Brazil and others issuing a statement in 1998. And had it not been for the non-alignment movement to endorse that, we probably would have seen that as part of history. Mexico, 2 examples. Mexico single-handedly brought the 1990 NPT review conference to a crash, because the nuclear weapon states especially the United States, did not want to talk about CTBT. Guess what happened? 3 years later, President Clinton announced that they're ready to negotiate the CTBT. And a very senior Mexican diplomat, I will not name his name, Tony will know, and the other Mexican diplomats online will know, was removed from his post at the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference, because he was fundamental in that process and stood his ground. So I want to sort of applaud the heroes in this field for sticking to your ground and moving this treaty to a point where it is not part of just a history, it is actually making history. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists, Rebecca as well for your insights, Tony for your deep insights into the run-up to this, and of course always Mexico's role in this. Elayne, your pictures spoke 1,000 words, again showing not only the diversity but also the activism on the floor that was shown. And Alex, of course, was so good to see you, and we wish you all the best for this extremely important conference. And then finally, Ms. Wada, thank you very much
Thank you.
being
Thank you
with
very
us,
much
Elayne,
for having me. Thank you very much.
Important moral message. All right, we're going to conclude the session.